Next Wednesday, April 4th, on the 44th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death in Memphis, we will dedicate a street in tribute to him near the National Civil Rights Museum. All eyes are on Memphis 2 days of the year at least. King Weekend in January, and this Wednesday's commemoration where I will offer the prayer. And I thought of this big week ahead in our city as I was rereading the Torah portion for this week, chapters 6 through 8 in Leviticus. The portion, Tzav, has the word mitzvah in it. It describes the ancient sacrifices which were meaningful only so long as the temple in Jerusalem stood. As you know, that ended in the year 70, when the temple was destroyed forever by the Roman legions. And since it would no longer be possible to offer sacrifices, which, by the way, were not just animals, they ate like a kosher Corky's barbecue, but not everyone was rich. And if you read the Bible, you didn't offer animals, you offered anything that you had: wheat, grain, oil, vegetarian options too. When it was no longer possible to offer those sacrifices because the temple was no longer around, our ancestors introduced what was then a radical innovation: verbal prayer. They invented this, the prayer book, which, if you didn't know, in Hebrew is known as Avodah Shebalev, which means sacrifices of the heart, offerings of the heart, to serve as a substitute, if you will, for the offerings of the ancient temple. But the ancient rabbis raise an interesting problem. Judaism has always taught, and I'm not a physicist or thermodynamic specialist, but I believe science confirms this, that whatever has been created cannot ever be completely destroyed. And for the Jewish mystics in particular, it wasn't enough for them to suggest that this prayer book was a substitute for sacrifice, because even though the Romans burned down the altar of the temple 2,000 years ago, they loved Jewish prayer, but they felt that they still had to account for the actual altar, which seemingly disappeared with the fall of Jerusalem, but it had to go somewhere. So where did the altar go? And the altar, they answered, is in every human heart. It's in each one of you and me. And how did they derive that explanation? From this week's Torah portion. Ve'esh hamizbeach tukad bo, which means the fire of the altar shall be kept burning, bo. The Hebrew word is bo. And that can mean a number of things. Most of the English Bibles say, on it. The fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it, the altar. But the rabbis knew Hebrew, and many of you do too. And it also can mean just as literally, in him. In who? In the descendants of Aaron and all of our ancestors. In every person who keeps the fire burning for the building of a better world. So every person's life, the rabbis submitted, can be a temple, because every person's life possesses the presence of God. And if each of our bodies is like the structure of a temple for the sacred, then every human heart, the rabbis concluded, is the altar. So that they say that is where the altar of the ancient temple went after it was only seemingly destroyed. Whenever our good inclinations prevail over our good inclinations, the light goes on. Whenever we do good deeds, whenever we give of ourselves, we add brilliance to the spiritual fire. that can potentially burn in the depth of our being. I'm not saying it burns in everyone. For some, the light's gone out. But every mitzvah, every sacred deed is a way of perpetuating the flame of faith. So each of us, whether you're from Memphis or Florida, New York or California, Israel or Collierville, every soul shares the responsibility of keeping alive the flame of goodness. For Jews, it's Judaism. For others, it's another path, not only in our hearts, but through our own example and our performance. And it's not just that evil, which we're seeing a lot of on TV, has a ripple effect. This is the place to remember that decency and the courage to do good things can impact others too. What do I mean? Boris Yeltsin, who died 5 years ago this month, was once asked, "What gave you the courage to stand firm and help ensure the fall of communism?" You know what he said? It was the story of Lech Walesa, the stubborn, committed electrician who helped bring democracy to Poland. And then when Walesa was asked, "What influenced you?" he said, "I was inspired by reading about the civil rights movement in the United States led by Dr. Martin Luther King." And then Dr. King, when he was asked what spurred him to action, he said that it was when he learned of the courage of an older woman who simply refused to move to the back of the bus. Boggles the mind to imagine that the act of one woman in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, set in motion a chain of influence that finally led to the fall of communism, if you're connecting the dots. But that's the way life is. You never know the impact of a simple act of courage, integrity, or faith. So the question for each of us is whether we hear that internal flame in us and act on it. Most people don't realize that Martin Luther King did not come from a poor family. He came from what he called a privileged family. So do you and I, you and me. We both come from privilege. We have a responsibility to make things better for others because of the privileges we enjoy. I want to close with one more story about how this light can burn from those who may not even be alive. Any of you remember the name of Oscar Romero, the gentle pastor, fearless Archbishop of El Salvador? At the horrific time when civil war raged in his land, 75,000 Salvadorans died in fighting, most of them non-combatants. I've been thinking about him as we let the slaughter happen in Syria, not that we know what to do. The government there said that the deaths were justified in the name of freedom and democracy, and Bishop Romero, one guy, one pastor, said that can't be true. And for saying so, he was branded a traitor by the government. And on a Sunday, exactly 32 years ago, he preached his last sermon, inspired by Martin Luther King, whose street we're going to dedicate on Wednesday. And he preached his last sermon, heard across El Salvador on a radio station, and all he did was he implored the army not to fire on fellow citizens. Well, that was the last straw for his opposition. The next day, as he was standing behind an altar, the same word in this week's Torah portion, at a hospital, conducting, in his faith tradition, Mass. At a hospital, he was assassinated in the hospital. And on the day of his funeral, there was a tremendous outpouring of people in the sanctuary to celebrate his life. They sang hymns, prayed prayers, and then something else happened during Mass that began a custom each time someone died in conflict. The minister began to read the names slowly, one at a time, of all the martyrs who had been killed. Similar to the way at the end of our service, I will read the names of those who have died at this season in years past. But after each name, a pocket of worshipers in the congregation would cry out, presente, meaning just what the word implies, present, here. still with us. The light of their fire is burning. Their soul is influencing us. One name read out after another, and one shout after another. Ramos. And back in that corner of the chapel, someone would say, presente. Ramirez, presente. And then the last name, Romero, presente. These worshipers were acknowledging a reality that Passover impels us to remember, and this week's Torah portion urges us to do. Draw strength from the fire and the examples of those who have shaped you, influenced you, brought you to Passover night and tonight, and carry on their legacy by bringing out not just the eternal flame, but the internal flame, and bring out that internal light in others. In closing, there may be no greater satisfaction than knowing you have left someone or something in the world better because you were here. Don't you agree? What better accomplishment or achievement in anyone's life can there be than when you die to know that you have left someone or something better? And just as a loved one's graciousness, faithfulness, influence lives in our own private shrine of memory in our temple this week, not this temple, but your temple, so may the same be said, that we will say of others and others will say of us, presente. Whether you don't think you're important, a student here just riding a bus, as Rosa Parks did in her time, or if you're in a position to do something significant for others, one word, tzav, this week's Torah portion, act now, as King did, sacrificing his life on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, defending garbage workers 44 years ago this Wednesday. And let us say, amen.